Welcome to the second video of the series of the studies on ekphrasis and intermediality, which concentrates on the analysis of romantic works, looking at several poems, among them Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley from 1818, Ode on a Grecian Urn from 1820 by John Keats. In both cases, the poets recreate objects, the statue of an Egyptian pharaoh in Shelley, and different figures depicted on the urn in the case of Keats. The depictions are not only a product of their experiences with these objects they have seen in museums, but also a product of their imaginations. In lines written under a picture of a girl burning a love letter from 1822, Letitia Elizabeth London was inspired by a painting by Henry James Richter under the same title, The Love Letter, from 1816. And in the case of Felicia Hemans, the inspiration comes from Madame de Stael's novel Corinne, ou l'Italie, and her poem Corinne at the Capitol. It's inspired by this novel as well as several depictions of Corinne, including one by William Blake's. Other interesting poets that could be explored are Leigh Hunt and Dante Gabriel Rossetti's double works, but they fall beyond the length of this video. As seen in the first lecture of the series, the different artistic disciplines have not always maintained an amicable relation or the same status. This debate has been going on throughout time up to the present day, but it became particularly strong in the Romantic period, with many artists exploring the alliance among the so-called sister arts. Among the various reasons for this increasing interest in the Romantic period are the following. First, the Romantic response to an environment of both destruction, corresponding to the French and North American and various other revolutions in Europe, and simultaneously nation building. Second, the discovery of ancient artworks in various excavations in Europe, for instance, the Herculaneum and Pompeii. Also a concern with their preservation in museums and recording of history and poetry. Various museums were established at this time, for example, the British Museum, the Louvre, the National Gallery, and alongside there were important figures who were invited to give public readings on these topics, such as Joshua Reynolds, who was a famous painter at the Royal Academy. The organizing of memorializing activities, such as the new Dygate Prize competition, which was established at Oxford University in 1806, were designed to acknowledge the best ekphrastic poems stimulated by these excavations in Pompeii and other places. And as I mentioned, architects and archaeologists such as Johann Winkelmann were invited to give conferences at the Royal Academy and other institutions in Britain. The expansions of various technologies that facilitated cheaper engraving was also another important factor for this dialogue between poetry, engraving, painting, and so on. The technique of steel engraving enabled both a better quality and quantity of reproduction than did the alternative technique of copper plate engraving. So also a little later, the development of the daguerreotype and photography. All of this drew artists to experiment with the modes of vision and its forms of recreation in different art forms. The dominance of pictures over words in annuals, a type of publication that became very, very popular. It's also another factor of influence. Scholar Lee Erickson has traced the turn towards ekphrasis and pictorialist description in the 19th century to the impact of these annuals. We will see that some of the poets that we are analyzing in this video composed their poems to accompany images in these annuals. So there was commemorative engraved plates also that were pictured in the annuals, and sometimes they were also accompanied by poetic descriptions. So for example, Erickson affirms that the shift from a romantic to a Victorian poetic stemmed directly from the popularity and the popular pressure exerted by the publishing market on poetry to conform to purely pictorial aesthetics. He claims this in his book, The Economy of the Literary Form, from 1996. The idea that all the different artistic disciplines share the same aim, the expression of feeling, was also another important aspect for the romantic exploration on ekphrasis and its relation to imagination. The utopian mindset of the romantics could have been almost a mechanism of survival in the fate of unpredictability, because we must remember that it was a period full of revolutions and also rapid industrialization. The unity of the arts served to show the supremacy of the spirit over the materiality of unpredictable change at the time. In the United Kingdom, the debate on the topic of aesthetics over whether or not the arts were all alike and could operate in conjunction is said to have begun with a series of articles published in 1712 on the Spectator, a journal edited by Joseph Addison. Under the title The Pleasures of Imagination, which appear in the Spectator issues 411 to 421, Addison explored the viability of the haute picture poiesis theory. The following is a quote from the first issue. Our sight is the most perfect and most delightful of all our senses. It fills the mind with the largest variety of ideas, converses with its objects at the greatest distance, and continues the longest in action without being tired or satiated by its proper enjoyments. The sense of feeling can indeed give us a notion of extension, shape, and all other ideas that enter at the eye, except colors. But at the same time, it is very much straitened and confined in its operations to the number, bulk, and distance of its particular objects. Our sight seems designed to supply all these defects, and must be considered as a more delicate and diffuse kind of touch that spreads itself over an infinite multitude of bodies, comprehends the largest figures, and brings into our reach some of the most remote parts of the universe. It is this sense which furnishes the imagination with its ideas, so that by the pleasures of the imagination or fancy, which I shall use promiscuously, I here mean such as arise from visible objects either when we have them actually in our view, or when we call up their ideas into our minds by paintings, statues, descriptions, or any the like occasion. The term aesthetics was coined around this time by German philosopher Alexander Baumgarten, while working on his dissertation on philosophy of art and poetry, a work he published in 1735. The German aesthetic tradition that stretches from the architect Johann Winckelmann, thoughts on the imitation of the painting and sculpture of the Greeks, from 1755, whom, as we have mentioned, had a great influence on British Romanticism through his collaborations with the Royal Society. Also Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, whose work Laocoon from 1766 we have explored in part 1 of this series of videos, through to Immanuel Kant's Critique of the Power of Judgment, published in 1790. In his critique of pure reason, Kant had been critical of certain aspects of Baumgarten's use of the term aesthetics, writing that, and I quote, "The Germans are the only people who presently, in 1781, have come to use the word aesthetics to designate what others call the critique of taste. They're doing so on the basis of a false hope conceived by the superb analyst Baumgarten. He hoped to bring our critical judging of the beautiful under rational principles, and to raise the rules for such judging to the level of a lawful science. Yet that endeavor is futile." Kant believed that Baumgarten aesthetics could never contain objective rules, laws, or principles of natural or artistic beauty. However, some years later, writing his Critique of Judgment in 1790, Kant conformed to Baumgarten's usage of the word aesthetic to mean the judgment of taste or the estimation of the beautiful. For Kant, an aesthetic judgment is subjective in that it relates to the internal feeling of pleasure or displeasure and not to any qualities in an external object. He also emphasized that alongside the ability to discriminate at the sensory level and the rationality involved in reflective contemplation, judgment required emotional and intellectual capacities. In Germany, the discussion continued with Friedrich Hegel, who considered aesthetics a branch of philosophy. Hegel was influenced in particular by Winckelmann, Kant, and Schiller, and his own thesis of the end of art, or what has been taken to be that thesis, has itself been the focus of close attention by Martin Heidegger, The Origin of the Work of Art, which was published in the 20th century, 1935. And also Theodor Adorno's aesthetics theory, published in 1970. Hegel's philosophy of art, or aesthetics, constitutes the first subsection of his philosophy of absolute spirit, or Geist in German, part of his Phenomenology of the Spirit, which he published in 1807. Art, for Hegel, also gives expression to spirit's understanding of itself. It differs from philosophy and religion, however, by expressing spirit's self-understanding, not in pure concepts or in images of faith, but in and through objects that have been specifically made for this purpose by human beings. Such objects, for example, stone, wood, the colors, sounds of words, render the freedom of spirit visible or audible to an audience. In Hegel's view, this sensuous expression of free spirit constitutes beauty. Unlike Kant, who took beauty to be part of a play between perception and sensory activity, rationality involved in reflexive contemplation and judgment, Schiller considers beauty to be a property of the object itself. In Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, which he published in 1795, Schiller expresses that beauty is freedom in appearance, autonomy in appearance. Schiller insists that freedom itself is something noumenal, to use Kant's terminology, and so it can never actually manifest itself in the realm of the senses. We can never see freedom at work in or embodied in the world of space and time. In the case of beautiful objects, therefore, whether they are the products of nature or of human imagination, Schiller affirms that it is all that matters that the object appears as free, not that it is really so. So Schiller's position is similar to that of Hegel in that beauty is the expression of human inner freedom, a sort of harmony that emerges from the work of creation when this is organically integrated with the world, with the external world. The form and content of art is part of the Platonic idea the divine Geist spirit that connects everything in the world as part of one organism. Art is thus the expression of the divine. Along these lines, the Romantic idea is to materialize. Aesthetics should permeate and shape human life. In Fragments on Literature and Poesy from 1797, Friedrich Schlegel, another one of the early leading figures in Germany, affirmed that the Romantic imperative demands all nature and science should become art. Art should become nature and science. The expression Romantic poetry was coined by Schlegel as he described in the Athenaeum fragment number 116. Rather than a particular genre or kind of poetry, Romantic poetry is, for Schlegel, poetry insofar as all poetry should be romantic. Romantic poetry brings out the limits of reason in virtue of being reflective. A quotation from Schlegel. Hovers on the wings of poetic reflection and is capable of raising that reflection again and again to a higher power. It was also during the Romantic period when the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the complete work of art, began to emerge. The term was first used by German writer and philosopher Transdorf and later reformulated by Richard Wagner in accordance with his eclectic and aesthetic ideals regarding music. Wagner envisioned opera as the fusion of music, poetry, and painting, and created a complex web of leitmotifs and recurring themes associated with the characters and themes of his compositions, many of them inspired in stories from the Germanic tradition, as well as Arthurian legends. Wagner went as far as constructing an opera house in Bayreuth, where his works could be staged, following his requirements of perfection. In another lecture, we will explore the concept of the complete work of art and how it has evolved until today in relation to the topic of intermediality as well. The notion of the absolute had been introduced by Kant and by the German idealists Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel as a concept beyond human capabilities, capable of grounding all knowledge. The debate, however, focused on the ways to approximate a concept that seemed ungraspable. Aesthetics became the mechanism to approach the absolute because of the variety of feelings associated to it, such as longing for the infinite, pleasure, love, and above all, creative imagination. Since the absolute seems to be an abstract concept, perhaps it was more related to the longing and desiring present in artistic forms. They felt that art, particularly poetry, was able to elevate individual things through a particular combinations with the rest of the whole. You have a couple of quotations there from Schelling, Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature. Natural phenomena and human beings are simply different manifestations of an encompassing nature, which is therefore nothing other than spirit. Nature should be visible spirit, and spirit should be invisible nature. And the second one, from moss, in which the trace of organization is hardly visible, to the noble form, Gestalt, which seems to have shed the chains of matter, the one and same drive within rules, a drive that strives to work according to one and the same ideal of purposiveness, striving to spread ad infinitum one and the same archetype or build, the pure form of our spirit. And this one is from Review of the Newest in Philosophical Nature, also by Schelling. As in Germany, the aim of British Romanticism was not to replace reason, but to point out the emotional aspects that they felt were present in the human mind, and they wanted to offer a unified and organic understanding of life, along the lines presented in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, with his famous statement, and I quote, "Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind." This emphasis on the conjunction of reason and passion is evident in William Wordsworth's essays on epitaph from 1810, and more explicit in his declaration in the preface of the Lyrical Ballads. All good poetry originates in the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Similarly, Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed that the aim of art was the union, and I quote, "the union of deep feeling with profound thought, the fine balance of truth in observing with imaginative faculty in modifying the objects observed." This is from Biographia Literaria. Keats also famously declared in the Ode on a Grecian Urn, "Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That's all you know on earth and all you need to know." However, the transcendental nature of Romantic poetry suggests that it does not transcend merely the boundaries of a particular genre, but even the boundaries of the literary as such, reaching out to other sister arts. Furthermore, according to philosopher of language and logician Ludwig Wittgenstein, this romantic imperative that philosophy and art must come together, and that philosophy can no longer be reduced to concepts and proposition, but must also include certain kinds of affective mental states, anticipates 20th century questioning of discursive reason and traditional logic. The Absolute was understood as encompassing both individuality as well as everything else, and to approximate it, a special mode of consciousness was required. It should include reason and feeling and be suitable for discerning the holistic and organic unity of the world. As a consequence, a debate ensued on account of the most favored ways of artistic expression to express the Absolute. Because of its inherent longing and desiring components, which are open-ended and future-oriented, Kant had attributed to aesthetic feeling the capacity of maintaining the state of representation of the mind. He believed that maintaining the beautiful in this way could strengthen it and reproduce it ad infinitum. The Romantics welcomed this structure of aesthetic feeling as particularly suitable for the pursuit of the Absolute. Like in Germany, English Romanticism was associated with a movement made up of both individual inspiration as well as a desire to make social changes that William Hazlitt identified as, and I quote, "the spirit of the time" in his 1825 work by the same title. The term spirit makes reference to the German Geist, whose semantic feel corresponded in English not only to ghost, but also to mind and intellect. Geist is a central concept in Friedrich Hegel's The Phenomenology of Spirit from 1807. In German, this is called Phänomenologie des Geistes. Geist was understood even before Hegel as a sort of world soul or anima mundi, a kind of universal spirit in the sense of pantheism, that is a spiritual essence which permeates all nature and animates the material and psychological universe. This conception was originally found in Plato in the Western world, and a quote from the Timaeus, "Wherefore, using the language of probability, we may say that the world became a living creature truly endowed with soul and intelligence by the providence of God." This is in part 1 of the Timaeus. The reflections on aesthetics and on the dialogue among the arts coincided with a period of inquiry into the role of emotions. During the Enlightenment, the discussion had focused mainly on sympathy and public justice. Thomas Hobbes, for example, believed that in the face of two emotions like pleasure or delight, pity and grief, delight was more prominent. And he believed that men usually are content in such a case to be spectators of the misery of their friends. This is a quotation from Elements of Law by Hobbes. Adam Smith, however, posited that others' grief experiences were also very real emotions experienced through our imagination. And I quote from Smith: sympathy is very properly said to arise from an imaginary change of situations. By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. Smith wrote in his Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1759. The previous year, 1758, David Hume had published a collection of essays entitled Essays Moral, Political and Literary. The first volume dealt mainly with political and aesthetic issues. The collection was later republished in collaboration with bookseller Alexander Kincaid. And Hume, in this volume, he expresses that taste involves not just the rational capacity to detect the structure of a composition. He thought that the aspects of sensory discriminations were also involved, and he linked those to human capacity for pleasure. In his Treatise of Human Nature, he wrote the following, and you have the quotation on your screen. It is indeed evident that when we sympathize with the passions and sentiments of others, these movements appear at first in our mind as mere ideas, and are conceived to belong to another person, as we conceive any other matter of fact. 'Tis also evident that the ideas of the affections of others are converted into the very impressions they represent, and that the passions arise in conformity to the images we form from them. The philosophers of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment, like Hume or Adam Smith, influenced the discussion taking place in the Romantic period on the role of individual and collective emotional experience and judgment. The intersection between Romantic aesthetics, ethics, and politics offer a particular challenge. The Romantics, particularly the German Romantics, turned to aesthetics to a large extent in order to pursue, rather than to reject, some of the core ethical and political values of the Enlightenment, such as autonomy or self-determination, and the ideal of creating a community around the notion of Bildung in Germany. It comes from build to like in English, to construct. While literally meaning formation, Bildung is best understood as a mode of ethical and cultural cultivation or self-realization that allows the individual to mature into interdependence and responsibility. The artwork is a good model for such an idea, insofar as it is, according to the Romantics, an organic and harmonious whole of diverse and even conflicting parts. So art and aesthetics provided a model for the Romantic political ideas, emphasizing the importance of aesthetics for ethical and political concerns. For example, Percy B. Shelley, in his famous Defense of Poetry, which he published in 1821, proclaimed that poets are the acknowledged legislators of the world. However, while during the first Romantic impulse, authors like Friedrich Schlegel had maintained strong political convictions, the shocking panorama of chaos and abuse taking place in France, for instance, brought many, including Wordsworth and Coleridge, to a growing conservatism, particularly around turn of the century, the 1800s. The French Revolution had shown the Romantics both the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but also the dangers of anarchism and the strife that revolutions carry with them. The proper path seemed education rather than revolution, and art not only offered a model for harmonious cultivating the soul, but it is also the best medium through which to achieve the moral education that leads to this harmony. So the Romantics did not agree with Kant's categorical imperative as proposing a problematical universal as ethics that discourages unique personalities and displaces the individual. However, they did not seek the radicalism and the radical individualism that would lead to anarchism. They strive to use art for the preservation of social bonds in communal life while maintaining individualism. This trend was stronger among the German Romantics, as well as among the members of the Transcendental Movement in Concord, Massachusetts, a group that continued Romantic trends in the United States after their independence. You have there a quote from Schlegel from Dialogue on Poetry. No man is merely a man, but at the same time he can and should be genuinely and truly all mankind. Therefore, man is reaching out time and again beyond himself to seek and find the completement of his innermost being in the depths of another, is certain to return to himself. In this romantic view of individual human sociability, philanthropy and love became core values for a genuine, sociable, but pluralistic community. The Romantics believed that the rise of capitalism and instrumentalism had suppressed natural social bonds and encouraged self-interest, and that a balance between individuality and sociability should be reached. So Friedrich Schlegel in Germany or William Blake in Britain put forth the idea that a poet is a genius and should be the prophet that provides solutions to link individuality and society. This organic social unity requires reciprocity among the parts and the whole, and the work of art provides a structural model for this political idea by virtue of its organic unity, a harmony also found in nature. For the Romantics, art is also capable of re-enchanting nature, insofar as it brings out a different conception of nature as organic rather than mechanic. On this organic conception, nature is an organic whole, which is reciprocally interdependent on its parts. It's also a domain of teleological rather than merely mechanical causality. And finally, it's a dynamic and living force which is self-organizing and self-generating. And it is in this sense that science, in a way, also become poetic, as the Romantics will explore. One example is Edgar Allan Poe. Along these lines of re-enchantment, and as a form of a secular alternative to religion, many scholars from the period were also interested in new forms of spiritualism and mysticism, as well as an inquiry into the unknown aspects of the self, the unconscious, the irrational, and so on. No? German philosophers such as Johann Gottfried von Herder or Carl Wilhelm or Friedrich von Schlegel or Arthur Schopenhauer question conventional morality and explore various schools of Hindu philosophy, for example, like the Vedanta. They also explore Gnosticism, Hermetism, and the occult traditions. The British poet William Blake was deeply influenced by the German philosopher and mystic and occultist Jacob Boehme, who wrote The Morgenröte im Aufgang, the rising of the dawn or aurora. And he was also influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg, who had departed from traditional Christianity. According to the Romantics, the empirical science is reductive not only in terms of its object, nature, but also in terms of its methodology, since it employs merely what Wordsworth called the independent intellect. The Romantics understood that this is a calculative reason, which is it's isolated from sensibility and imagination, as Wordsworth explains in the Prelude. Human beings should strive to return to the laws of things which lie beyond the reach of human will or power, the life of nature. This is a quotation from Wordsworth's poem The Tables Turn from the Lyrical Ballads. So Wordsworth, like other romantics, believed that it was necessary to adopt a more holistic approach that included practical reason, sensibility, feeling, imagination, and above all, the aesthetic capacity of the mind. Blake's poem, Auguries of Innocence, is particularly illustrative in this regard. You have the poem on your screen. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. A robin red breast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hells through all its regions. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood. As seen, this poem by Blake anticipates many of the concerns of animal parties nowadays. No? So to the Romantics, as we have mentioned, artworks and nature are analogous in their organic interdependence between the parts and the whole. We have mentioned that Kant believed that in nature, this organic organization is causal, part of an existential unity of life. In aesthetics, the organic interdependence is formal, for it does not explain the existence of things, but rather it focuses on their beauty. So the Romantics go one step forward to affirm that because of the capacity of judgment and self-judgment, artworks are self-regulatory. They're quasi-organisms and not artifacts, not mechanical artifacts. Thus, the beauty in nature stimulates a feeling of infinity, where representation looks simultaneously outside and inside itself, replicating the acts of mimesis and diegesis ad infinitum. Aesthetics is central for the Romantic Revolution in its capacity to enchant nature, that is, a process of rendering nature magical, mysterious, and inspiring. This process is akin to what formalist criticism and modernists knew as defamiliarization, whereas by means of atypical metaphors, art and poetry call attention to things rendered invisible by custom and habit, providing them with a new coloring that renders them visible to our blinded eyes. Along these lines, Wordsworth claims, crossing media borders and using pictorial terms, that poetry should start with the most familiar and contingent, the incidents and situations from common life. It's a quote from the Lyrical Ballads. But it should also strive to elevate them. And I quote, throwing over them a certain coloring of the imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual way. And further and above all, poetry should aim to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of our nature. This is from the preface of the Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth calls on poets to write in the language of low and rustic life, but it is exactly the poetic use of this language that allows the passions of those whose language, that is, ordinary people, to be incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. And this is also a quote from Wordsworth. And it is through this process of romanticizing that nature appears again as great and inspiring. And I quote again, the great nature that exists in words of mighty poets. Again from the Prelude by Wordsworth. The Romantic movement in Britain has been located by some critics between 1785 and 1830, between the initial publication of Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, and William Blake's poems. For others, the starting point would have been the publication of Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads in its second edition of 1802. Wordsworth's description of nature is possibly the most powerful portrayal and inspiring, and reveals these ideas of the poetic imagination. And you have there some lines from Tintern Abbey. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came, unwearied in that service, rather say, with warmer love, or with far deeper seal of holier love. The Romantic period contributed to close the gap opened by the empirical tradition between the rational cognitive functions of the mind and the non-rational functions grounded on emotions, affects, and prospective capacities such as intuition and imagination. In this process, Romantic ideologies turned away from the constraint of social and religious institutions, searching for a return to nature and ancient mystical and esoteric spiritual traditions, as well as ancient Asian traditions. Above all, as sociologist Colin Campbell has indicated, Romanticism was a way of feeling, and I quote, a state of mind in which sensibility and imagination predominates over reason. It tends towards the new, towards individualism, revolt, escape, melancholy, and fantasy. Sir Humphrey Davy, a Cornish chemist and inventor of Davy's lamp, who established the field of electrochemistry, was among the scientists who sought this organic integration of disciplines, even beyond the arts, including the sciences. What Edward Wilson, writing in the 20th century, has termed consilience. And I quote from Humphrey Davy, Fragmentary Remains. O most magnificent and noble nature, have I not worshipped thee with such love as never mortal man before displayed? Adored thee in thy majesty of visible creation, and searched into thy hidden and mysterious ways as poet, as philosopher, as sage. According to North American literary critic Mayor Howard Abrams, author of The Mirror and the Lamp, which he published in 1953, as well as Natural Supernaturalism, which he published in 1971, the Romantics emphasize subjectivity at the expense of social institutions, representing, and I quote from Abrams, little of the social dimension of human experience, for although they insist on the importance of community, they express this matter largely as a profound need of the individual consciousness. However, Abrams also indicates that the romantic spirit moves beyond mimesis in order to mold this subjectivity by means of the material they have at hand. And I quote again from him, from Abrams: "The poet's invention and imagination were made thoroughly dependent from their materials." This is from the mirror and the lamp. Abrams' metaphor of the mirror and the lamp signals the human mind not as a passive mirror that reflects reality, that would be mimesis, but as a lamp that sheds light on the reflection of reality, and thus it transforms it actively and subjectively during the creative process. Abrams supported this argument with references to Percy B. Shelley and to William Wordsworth. And I quote from Abrams again. Shelley defined poetry as the expression of the imagination, while Wordsworth says imagination is a subjective term. It deals with objects not as they are, but as they appear to the mind of the poet. According to Abrams, Wordsworth and Coleridge mixed traditionally separated genres and discursive registers in their innovative collection of poetry, the Lyrical Ballads, the first edition appearing in 1798. And the title itself encapsulates the spirit of the age as it levels the popular folk ballad tradition with the highbrow literary lyric. However, regarding the integration of various artistic forms, Wordsworth and Coleridge were more conservative, according to Abrams. And you have on your screen a quotation from The Mirror and the Lamp. In the place of painting, music becomes, for the romantic, the art frequently pointed to as having a profound affinity with poetry. For if a picture seems the nearest thing to a mirror image of the external world, music, of all the arts, is the most remote. Indeed, for Abrams, music was the paradigmatic art form to which poetry aspired because it was untainted by any worldly concerns with giving a picture of reality, and because it was itself virtually untainted by material embodiment. This valorization of sound over visible forms of expression may be observed in Wordsworth's The Prelude, which dates from 1805, where the author recollects on childhood and youth memories, which, and I quote, "felt whatever there is of power in sound to breathe an elevated mood by form or image unprofane. When such a holy calm did overspread my soul, that I forgot that I had bodily eyes, and what I saw appeared like something in myself, a dream, a prospect in the mind." Similarly, Jeffrey Armand, another very famous critic on Romanticism, stressed in his study on Wordsworth's poetry that the English poet placed a greater emphasis on inner subjectivity, and I quote, "an identity against sight, its fever and triviality." This interest in the acoustic seems to be present in many of Wordsworth's poems, such as The Solitary Reaper, to give another example. The emphasis on the visible and on transcending mere sense perception in order to cultivate an inner imaginative mode of perception is also an important feature in the works by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, whom Abrams claimed discouraged the ekphrastic project. The following is a quote from Biographia Literaria by Coleridge, so we can see some of the ideas. The poet described an ideal perfection, brings the whole soul of man into activity with the subordination of its faculty to each other according to that relative worth and dignity. He diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by the synthetic and magical power to which I would exclusively appropriate the name of imagination. This power first puts in action by the will and understanding and retain under their irremissive, though gentle and unnoticed control, an axis that reveals itself in the balance or reconcilement of opposite and discordant qualities, of sameness with difference, of the general with the concrete, the idea with the image, the individual with the representative, the sense of novelty and freshness with the old and familiar objects, a more than usual state of emotion with more than usual order, judgment ever awake, and steady self-possession with enthusiasm and feeling profound or vehement. And while it blends and harmonizes the natural and the artificial, still subordinates art to nature, the manner to the matter, and our admiration of the poet to our sympathy for the poetry. Coleridge's supernatural poems, such as the Rime of the Ancient Mariner from 1798 or Kubla Khan from 1816, may indeed try to make the reader conscious of whatever transcends the visual. In a lecture on Romeo and Juliet from 1811, Coleridge said that, and I quote, "the power of genius was not in elaborating a picture." And you have there another quote from Lectures on Shakespeare by Coleridge. "The grandest effort of poetry, where the imagination calls forth, not to produce a distinct form, but a strong working of the mind, still offered what it is still repelled, and again creating what is again rejected, the result being what the poet wishes to impress, namely the substitution of a sublime feeling of the unimaginable for a mere image." A poet's ability to thus articulate the sublime was for Coleridge a sign of superiority, a sign of the narrow limits of painting as compared with the boundless power of poetry. Painting cannot go beyond a certain point. Poetry rejects all control, all confinement. As already seen, within German Romanticism, there was an understanding of the cultural nation as the embodiment of the political, with no separation between individual and group subjectivity. This model of organic national unity is much stronger in Germany than it is in Britain, also because in the middle of the 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire, prior to the reformulation of Germany as a nation, was split up in 314 territories and towns, and into over 1,400 free lordships. Thus, as mentioned, German thinkers emphasized the notion as Bildung, as a process of autonomous self-development that should occur following the dictates of reason as a form of moral law, but also as part of the collective social, that is the nation. This desire for the elimination of limits and boundaries is also evident in, for example, the thought of Friedrich Schiller in Aesthetic Education of Man, a book from 1794. And you have there a quotation from Schiller. Poetry, in its most perfect development, must be like music, grip us powerfully, but at the same time like a sculpture, surround us with quiet clarity. The perfect style belonging to each of the variations art forms is shown in its ability to eliminate their specific limits without giving up their specific advantages. In Britain and also in France, however, the connection between the individual and society and state was achieved by means of a social contract between individuals as free decision-making agents. In other words, the state was constituted to safeguard pre-existing rights of individuals. These ideals can be traced back at least to John Locke, who had argued that people have rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and property, and that these rights have a foundation independent of the laws of any particular society. So governments, according to Locke, exist by the consent of the people and in order to protect their rights. So philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century and 18th century, they had formulated perceptual experience on the basis of all knowledge, since it nourishes the mind, allowing generation of ideas from the outside world. According to these authors, the external world can only be understood once the mind processes sensory experience. The Romantic revised these theories in order to emphasize that reason alone was not sufficient, that the artists could create without world experiences, attaining inspiration from their own creative genius. For them, imagination could make the connection with the Platonic realm of the ideas, the Geist. In The Tiger, for example, William Blake celebrates the divine force of creation that created even a deadly beast like the tiger. In their third and fourth stanzas, Blake personifies this force as a blacksmith, Hephaestus in Greek myth, heating, hammering, and twisting the essence of life, the ideas, into shape, forms. No, the strong heat and the beat of the repetition of words give the lyric a martial tone in Blake's poem, creating a tension between beauty and terror that would illustrate Edmund Burke's negative sublime. No? And I quote from Blake, "And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart, and when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet, what the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain, what the anvil, what dread grasp, there it deadly terrors clasp." In his Defense of Poetry from 1821, which was published posthumously in 1840, Percy B. Shelley indicates that poetry is the expression of imagination, and he adds that it is connate with the origin of man. He goes on to place poetry in the column of the divine and organic processes, and I quote, "A poem is the very image of life, expressed in its eternal truth, the creation of actions according to the unchangeable forms of human nature, as existing in the mind of the Creator." End of quote. The task of the poets is to interpret and present the poem. Again, Shelley uses the following metaphor: poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted. And he goes on to conclude that poets are the acknowledged legislators of the world. Shelley explains the influence that literature has had in society throughout history and how writers should engage socially. Thus, it is clear that the Romantic poets were also at pains to show that the individual imagination is in service of the social world. Likewise, William Wordsworth defended this need for change in the preface to the lyrical ballads. And Coleridge also uses aesthetics as a political instrument, describing the symbol as that, and I quote, "which abides itself as a living part in a unity, while it enunciates the whole." This is from the Statesman's Manual, a lay sermon addressed to the higher classes of society, from 1819. Coleridge also distinguished between civilization and cultivation in his essay on the constitution of the church and state. And these two aspects are present in the etymology of the very term culture. So to Coleridge, civilization was associated with economic development, while cultivation involved the spiritual state of the nation, the Geist, as a unity and not necessarily involving economic progression. According to David Kaiser, the harmonious relationship both between individual subjects and the political state and between particular national cultures and universal reason is predicated on the reconciliation of the particular and the universal embodied in the romantic symbol. Thus, it is interesting to explore the interrelations between subjectivity and political formation and how they become gradually dependent on a third element, which are the material processes of modernization, that is, the creation of media products, including artistic practices, and how they impact the public sphere in the terms that Junger Habermas, the German contemporary philosopher, has formulated in his book Philosophical Discourse of Modernity. Habermas mentions that the emergence of an autonomous subjectivity, sort of part of the democratic world, is a defining feature of the philosophical and historical concept of modernity. And as other thinkers associated to the Frankfurt School tradition, they are Marxist critics, Habermas formulates his theories of the public sphere and communicative action in order to solve the problem of how modernity, associated to material processes of modernization and the goal of achieving greater democracy and individual freedom, seems to be no longer able to sustain this dialogue between the individual and the collective subjectivity. So this is the very problem that the Romantics were facing. How does the individual and the collective come together? So Habermas defines the private sphere as an audience-oriented subjectivity, a mode in which subjectivity is confirmed by rational communication in the public sphere. In other words, to give you a very example of today, our participation in social networks, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, is an individual action, but it's an action that is audience oriented. So in other words, we are manifesting our subjectivity in a collective environment. So the aim is to confirm this individuality, this subjectivity in the social. So as we have seen, one of the main aspects of the debate taking place in the Romantic period is the conflict between the individual freedom and the collective obligations, and the creation of a public sphere in which visibility enters into the debate by means of an emphasis on the role of art and how art contributes or may contribute to make visible parts of historical memory, and also offer visibility to certain groups of people and so on. No, this connects the whole discussion with the notion of ekphrasis and as the translation from one artistic media to another, which is one of the things that we are addressing in this series of videos. How the circulation of information through different artistic media gives greater visibility to something. No, one important figure it's Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, the philosopher who influenced not only the Romantics but also Victorian artists like Dickens. The following is a quote from Carlyle: "In a symbol there is concealment, but yet revelation. Therefore, by silence and by speech acting together comes a double significance. By symbols, accordingly, is man guided and commanded, made happy and made wrecked." By symbols, we mean today semiotics, the use of different types of signs, okay? But we will come to that in another lesson. So as we have seen, Wordsworth and Coleridge might have been more reluctant to include the visual in the transcendental conceptions. But well into the 1800s, other Romantic artists began to expand the limits of representation and the political by using memorialization, playing with different art forms. So, going back to Thomas Carlyle, he coined both the term visuality and the verb visualizing in a series of writings between 1837 and 1841. The terms followed from his sense of his work as embodying the eye of history, capturing the synchronical as well as diachronical qualities of history writing. Like Coleridge and others, Carlyle wanted to convey an idea of the whole, which he rendered by means of what he called a succession of vivid pictures. It is important to mention that the scientific debate on visuality and how it impacted on the philosophical and artistic discussion at the time. For instance, a Scottish scientist, Sir David Brewster, was working on optics, and he affirmed in 1832 that the mind's eye is actually the body's eye, and that the retina is the common tablet on which both classes of impressions are painted, and by means of which they receive their visual existence according to the same optical laws. So there's a whole discussion on vision, visuality, and of course this is going to coincide also with the development of photography and the daguerreotype, as we mentioned earlier in this lecture. Carlyle distinguished between inward and outward visual impressions, holding that both were meaningless unless motivated by the inner or spiritual eye. In a letter addressed to Carlyle from his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson, the North American philosopher, transcendentalist philosopher, he noted the following: "I think you see in pictures," he told Carlyle. Emerson's remark implied that it was possible to see otherwise than in pictures, referring to the previous prominence of text over image. Another example, which links nicely with Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth, if you're interested in to explore what the monomyth is, refer to my series of lectures on myth criticism. So Campbell sets up an idea about a myth that permeates all narratives, and it coincides with Carlyle's discussion present in his lectures on heroes. In the monomyth, we have a hero who goes through a number of trials, okay? So Carlyle is also writing about heroes, and he argued that heroes had the insight, that is inner sight, to see beyond ordinary people. Seeing himself as a hero, Carlyle suggests that the historian has this capacity to look not only forward, but also in retrospect, and make the connections to the present moment. So in this sense, the hero is the agent of communal visuality. However, this brings into the question whether heroes are the only representatives of a small elite minority. So the whole discussion in Carlyle recasts the possibility of contemplating the political as related to visuality and representation, and also to the artistic. Just to give another example of how technological advances help channel the debate, in the following comment from his lecture on heroes, when writing after Louis Daguerre, the inventor of the daguerreotype, and William Henry Fox Talbot, who was also a photographer, they had announced the success of their photographic devices, and Carlyle declared the following, and this is a quotation from On Heroes. "What an enormous chiaroscura magnifier is tradition, enough for us to discern far in the uttermost distance some gleam as of a small real light shining in the center of that enormous chiaroscura image, to discern that the center of it all was not a madness and nothing, but a sanity and something. So the border crossing between different perceptual metaphors is also evident in the same volume when Carlyle evaluates heroism in Dante's Divine Comedy, and he declares that it was a song in which every compartment, and I quote, every compartment of it is worked out with intense earnestness into truth, into clear visuality that became a painting. Similarly, Carlyle contemplates Johann Wolfgang Goethe as an example of the hero, as a literary man, and he explains his vision in the following terms. And again, I quote from Carlyle: vision of the inward divine mystery, and strangely out of his books, the work rises imaged once more as godlike, the workmanship and temple of a god. He's referring to Goethe. But indeed, Goethe was not a romantic himself. He was a member of the so-called Sturm und Drang, storm and stress movement, which was a huge influence on European Romanticism. But Goethe was also very influential with his theory of color. He had a book on the theory of color. And this was an exploration in relation to media borders and ekphrasis. And another point also of crossing these borders is his concept of Weltliteratur, Weltliteratur, world literature, which in recent critical theory, it's the concept of world literature based on the Institute of World Literature at Harvard University, David Damrosch. It has been putting through the idea, the importance of the circulation of works of art to make up this idea of world literature. And of course, circulation is not just about translation, it's also about media. Transformation is also about ekphrasis, it's also about media borders. Okay, so this concept of the world literature, the Weltliteratur, is the creation of a universal literature beyond the borders of each national literature. So it's Goethe contemplated literature as a common universal language that would allow the free circulation of texts around the world. So according to Nicholas Mitsoeff, so central was Carlyle's visualized heroics to the period that those seeking emancipation nonetheless passed by it, creating an inversed or veiled visibility to respond to the masculine imperial hero. Inverse visibility, visuality is any moment of visual experience in which the subjectivity of the viewer is called into question by the density or opacity of what he or she sees. So these flickering, excessive, hyperreal, overlaid, pixelated, disjunctive, and distracting moments are a spectral dust in the eyes of visuality that cause it to blink and become momentarily unsighted. Veil visuality performs a similar function by dividing visuality into two by means of the veil that is both visible and invisible at once. So while Mirzoev is referring to Carlyle, the whole quotation could be applied to Romantic aesthetics. So I hope to have shown in a very succinct way the debate on the limits of media borders and the crossing, as it took part also within the philosophical and the scientific debate in the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, and how it also had an impact on the public sphere and therefore on the political. So far we've seen how the Romantics tried to reconcile individualism, collectivism, and art. How and not only those ideas, but also trying to create an organic community of all different disciplines. So even though I didn't have the possibility to go in depth into the situation in science, the whole discussion of the scientific evolution during that century is very much related to the philosophical background that I have just presented. The following lines are going to deal with practical applications. We're going to look at different poets and see how they try to show that the speaking across arts, ekphrasis, and intermedial connections, the looking into media borders, it's very important in order to give visuality, in order to create the public sphere. Okay, so the Romantics thought that the mind is no longer a passive filter between reality and creation. We've seen that, no? And that it's an active element, and that experiences are valid sources for literary composition only after the poet has internalized them and molded them using his or her current feelings and past experiences. This is what Abrams has termed, in The Mirror and the Lamp, a theory of expressive art. So in relation to ekphrastic poetry, we have another very important critic whose name is James Heffernan, and he emphasizes that visual art, like poetry, also has had the capacity to capture an instant of time in sculpture, architecture, painting, and transcend time. So against Abrams, who maintained that Wordsworth tried to make clear the supremacy of poetry and sound over visual art, Heffernan suggests that this might not have been so in several cases. For example, in elegiac stanzas suggested by a picture of Peel Castle in a storm, painted by Sir George Beaumont, this is a composition that Heffernan considers clearly ekphrastic. Wordsworth is inspired by this painted by Beaumont. No. Also, another critic, Mitchell, W.J.T. Mitchell, he also indicates that the poets in the Romantic period begin to establish a sort of dialogic meditation in terms of ekphrasis, but sometimes different forms of ekphrasis. In this case, in the case of Wordsworth, he terms it ekphrastic indifference. So let us explore why this is so, no? So starting from the image of the castle on the canvas, Wordsworth revives and captures in 15 stanzas his feelings based on what the painting suggests. So we argue that the poem contains a certain emotional negativity, a sort of negative sublime. For instance, is in the line, "Deep distress hath humanized my soul," which is related to the fact that Wordsworth's younger brother, John, a captain employed by the East India Company, had died in 1805, along with several members of his crew, on board of a ship called the Earl of Abergavenny, off the shore of Weymouth, which is where Peel Castle is situated. So his subjective interpretation influences the poem. So he looks at Beaumont's painting, which was painted 1 year after his brother had died, and Wordsworth is meditating on this painting and commenting upon it. The picture is now displayed in Wordsworth Museum in Grasmere in Cumbria. Okay, so there are 3 scenes described in the poem: the real landscape surrounding the castle, Beaumont's vision, and finally the poet's alternative representation, these three. So the composition presents the contrast among the three sceneries, the real landscape, the two different ways of artistic representation, one pictorial, one poetical. The emphasis is placed on showing the contrast between both modes, taking the form of prosopopeic dialogue between the poet talking to the castle and the nature surrounding it, as if all of them were connected in a sort of organic anima mundi. The poem holds the memory of his brother, and at the same time it lets it go. So we can see this in the lines. Farewell, farewell, the heart that lives alone, housed in a dream, at distance from the kine. Because to the poet, the fact that everything is connected in nature is a sort of consolation. And we have this in the last line. Not without hope, we suffer and we mourn. In 1818, Percy B. Shelley published Ozymandias in the Examiner, a newspaper established in 1808 by brothers John, Robert, and Leigh Hunt. The poem appeared under the pen name Ekphrasis only a week and a half after the debut of Frankenstein, the first novel by his future wife, Mary Godwin Shelley. At the time of its publication, both Shelley and Mary were already in Byron's rented house, Villa Diodati in Switzerland, the place of inspiration for Frankenstein. Shelley was in the habit of signing his published works with pseudonyms. In the letters written in April 1815 to his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg, Mary Godwin repeatedly and playfully referred to herself as a dormouse, which the letters make apparent because apparently it was one of Shelley's pet names for Mary. As it turns out, Ekphrasis is also a kind of portmanteau word which combines the Greek suffix erastes, meaning lover of, and the Latin Gliridae, which is the scientific term for the family of the dormouse. So signing Ozymandias with the name Ekphrasis meant sort of lover of dormouse. So it was like an inside joke to show Shelley's affection for Mary. The Examiner had a reformist and somewhat radical orientation, and William Blake seems to have described it, the office of the Examiner, as containing a nest of villains. In 1813, the Examiner had attacked the Prince Regent, George, and the British government sentenced the brothers, the Hunt brothers, to 2 years in prison. The newspaper consistently published leading writers of the day, including Lord Byron, who was a good friend of the Hunts, and John Keats, and William Hakluyt, as well as Shelley himself. Both Keats and Shelley belonged to a literary group that gathered round Leigh Hunt at Hampstead. Hunt had introduced Keats to Shelley. Both Shelley and Byron helped Leigh Hunt financially. Some years after Shelley's death, in 1822, Mary Shelley and her son, on succeeding to the family estates, settled an annuity upon Hunt. In the 1830s, under a new leadership, the journal published contributors like Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, John Stuart Mill, John Foster, William Makepeace Thackeray, or Charles Dickens. In the final edition of the Examiner appeared in 1881, and of course there's a new newspaper that is called under the same name, but it's not the same newspaper. So Shelley's Ozymandias is a sonnet written in iambic pentameter, but with an atypical rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B, A, C, D, C, E, D, E, F, E, F. The name Ozymandias was the Greek translation for User Mat Ra, which was the throne name of Ramses II, meaning the justice of Ra is powerful. So the pharaoh is often referred to as Ramses the Great, and the power of his imposing figure is reinforced in the poem by the lines written on the pedestal of the statue describing his mighty power. So the poem was inspired by the transportation of the statue from Egypt to London. In the 1790s, Napoleon, who at that time was when Shelley composed Ozymandias, was already in prison in Santa Elena. But in the 1790s, he had wanted to bring the statue himself from Egypt to France, but it was an unsuccessful attempt because of the colossal weight, 7.5 tons. Apparently, Shelley would have written the poem before the statue's arrival, in competition with his friend Horace Smith, who wrote a very similar poem under the same title. Shelley's narrative voice speaks of a traveler from an antique land who describes the broken statue, its pieces scattered and half sunk in the sand of the desert. Shelley's radical political views are evident in the poem, which deals mainly with the perishability of power and fame. According to Heffernan, Shelley, and I quote, challenges the tenacity of power itself by attacking an icon made to represent and perpetuate it, undermining the assumption that visual art can perpetuate or even unequivocally honor what it represents. So D.W. Thompson has also insisted that the despotic appearance described in the poem, the sneer, frown, wrinkled lip, all these gestures of contempt and tyranny in the statue, and Shelley's interpretation, which it's similar to what is described on the pedestal, which says that the mighty power of the pharaoh. But it does not read exactly as the original, Thompson argues, although there is this similar emphasis on the power of the pharaoh. It doesn't read as the original in the real statue. So comparing Shelley's Ozymandias and Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, Heffernan indicates that Shelley's sonnet questions what Keats' ode takes for granted. That is, the immutability of visual art. So while Keats sings to the permanence of the pictorial images on the urn beyond the passage of time, Shelley questions the transcendence of the ruin. The statue was designed to represent political power in its most intimidating and enduring aspects. The fear that might have provoked could be considered an aspect of Edmund Burke's negative sublime, but this materialization of power gradually disintegrates, questioning the permanence of this sublimity. In both cases, however, the poetic text remains a record of memory, revealing also the poet's ambition to make his words at last their subject. And this is a quote from Heffernan. So this becomes evident in the conclusion of the poem. And I read from the poem, nothing besides remain round the decay of the colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. So although the statue and the inscription might disintegrate, Shelley's words, in their invisible materiality, will perpetuate its existence.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
So moving now to John Keats' work, which is saturated by descriptions of artworks as well as the use of technical terms from sculpture and painting. Some of his ekphrastic poems were published in the Annals of the Fine Arts, a prestigious journal founded in 1816 by artists, architects, and collectors. For instance, another very famous poem, a short one that you have there on your screen, On Seeing the Elgin Marbles, appeared there in 1817, a sonnet describing a collection of classical Greek marble sculptures made under the supervision of the architect and sculptor Phidias, and originally part of the Parthenon and of other buildings in the Acropolis of Athens. And between 1801 and 1812, Thomas Bruce, the seventh Earl of Elgin, who had been ambassador to Greece, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire, ordered their removal and transportation to Britain. So there was a lot of controversy surrounding the event, with Lord Byron, for instance, strongly objecting to the removal of the marbles from Greece, a fact that is mentioned in his narrative poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which was published in 1812. So Keats had visited the marbles at the British Museum the same year of the sonnet's composition. And so the poem describes his sensation on seeing the fragments with an elegiac tone that emphasizes a desired unity with the once total masterpiece placed in the Parthenon. But of course, the best known ekphrastic poem by Keats is Ode on a Grecian Urn from 1820. It was also published in the 1820 issue of the Annals of the Fine Arts. And as in On Seeing the Elgin Marbles, Keats' poem presents an impressionistic painting of his impressions of the Greek urn by means of words. The poem might have been composed alongside Keats' own drawing of the object, as seen in the British Museum. The title of the poem, with the preposition on, emphasizes the fact that the poem describes a pictorial ode on the surface of the urn, rather than being an ode to the urn itself. The relationship between text and image is established from the beginning, conveying also the idea of musicality, because in ancient Greece, these glorifying lyrical stanzas were originally performed with musical accompaniment. In both poems, Keats highlights the objects and the figures frozen in time and space, praising this particular moment in time and turning it into a sublime and transcendent experience. Thus, the poet shows the ability of art, in this case poetry, to immortalize a situation or an object, allowing him in this case to reflect on the greatness of the classical Greek period. The vase which inspired Keats' poem seems to have been furtively exported by Charles Townley, a wealthy antiquarian and collector who had traveled the grand tour of Italy buying antiques of different kinds. The drawing of the dying gladiator, which is another example, another drawing that inspired Felicia Hemans' ekphrastic poems by the same name, it's also part of the Townley collection at the British Museum. Later we will briefly talk about Felicia Hemans and the Dying Gladiator, as well as other ekphrastic poems by this female author. As with the Elgin Marbles, Keats focuses on the fragmentary scenes on the urn, rather than referring to the complete object. So he tries to draw an imaginary story out of them and giving voice to the depictions. So lines like, "Thou still and ravished bride of quietness" are a clear example of how the poet emphasizes the static silence of the paintings and the sculpture. In fact, the second stanza tells a story of the musical instruments within the drawings, unheard but yet, and I quote, "more sweetly than our rhyme, repeated again. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter." So this assertion presents the alternative position to Wordsworth and Coleridge tenets, that poetry has higher capacities of transcendence than the visual arts, precisely because it lacks materiality. So the line, "forever piping songs forever new," introduces a meta-reflection on the poem, for odes were often accompanied by playing flutes, so that Keats is referring to the ode inscribed on the urn, which in turn is the subject of his own ode. So in this way, his composition is a mirror image of the drawings, hence highlighting the complementarity of the poetic and visual arts. So some authors, like Charles Patterson, have even read the poem in terms of gender differences, visualizing the urn as a feminine object because of its shape and also because of the opening lines, which use the term bride right at the beginning of the poem. So the union metaphor is retaken by means of the line at the end, "forever wilt thou love," almost as a marriage contract, perpetuated in the eternal spring, symbolized by the evergreen trees, also which appear in line 22 of the poem. So if you need more information about Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn, you can refer to the summary that you have on the virtual campus. Now we're going to be talking about two female authors. The first one is Letitia Elizabeth Landon, and the second one is Felicia Hemans. And first, we're going to be talking about this poem by Landon entitled "Lines Written Under a Picture of a Girl Burning a Love Letter." This poem appeared in the Literary Gazette in November 1822, and it was later part of her second collection of poems entitled The Improvisatrice and Other Poems, which she published 2 years later in 1824. And it also appeared in another collection entitled Fisher's Drawing Room Scrapbook in 1833. So what is this name, the Improvisatrice, that is being used in her second collection of poems? It refers to the idea that during the 18th and 19th centuries, the art of improvisation flourished in Italy, and a number of artists were called improvisatrices, if female, or improvisatore, if male, and they performed at theaters and private saloons. In response to requests from the audiences, they improvised and recited poetry on the spot. So their reputation was known to British people by way of reviews in journals and reports of English travelers who were doing the grand tour. For example, Lord Byron, Mary and Percy Shelley were among those. So as we have mentioned, the poem is based on a painting by Henry James Richter from 1816 entitled The Love Letter, showing a scene from Sir Walter Scott's novel The Antiquary. So Scott's novel also contains a similar theme of secrecy built in its main plot. So lines written under a picture of a girl burning a love letter, behind the frame, there was also a sliced panel hidden as in secret behind this frame. And just as the line in the title says, written under the picture. So this scene has been the inspiration for several engravings and prints. For over a decade, London also contributed to an immensely popular weekly, the Literary Gazette, reviewing and editing. Her collaborations with the Literary Gazette were controversial due to her secret affair with the editor of the journal, William Jordan. Many of her poems concern loss, treachery, and rejection. Nearly 40 of them begin with the word I, like lines written on a picture of a girl burning a love letter. Biographers later found that she bore 3 illegitimate children to Jordan, and that their relationship lasted between 1822 and 1834. Although rumors of their affair circulated, Landon publicly denied the relationship during her lifetime. Eventually, in 1836, she married George McLean, an officer and governor of the Gold Coast, now Ghana, and they moved there. And she died only 2 months later in strange circumstances. A strong drug medication was found next to her. Critics concede that Landon's poems are an early attempt to break traditional gender roles assigned to women. Her writing is both feminine and erotic, often ironic. She signs her compositions with letters LEL, always dominating the page. In her second collection, along with lines written under a picture of a girl burning a love letter, which seems superficially autobiographical, Landon incorporates poems that borrow characters from famous literary figures such as Marlowe, Wordsworth, Madame de Staël, Sappho, Milton, Shakespeare, Dryden, Pope, Shelley, of course, Walter Scott. As for Felicia Hemans, as we shall see, Madame de Staël's Corinne, ou l'Italie, which was a novel by Madame de Staël, is a favorite inspiration for the heroine of the Improvisatrice. In all these compositions, she establishes a dialogue with the European literary tradition while introducing a personal sensual note. Some authors have pointed out that Landon's heroines are portrayed as suffering because of men. However, lines written under a picture of a girl burning a love letter seems to be an ironic provocation on the nature of love as a commodity. The speaker, perhaps the author herself, is the skeptical reader of the letter, angry that her lover's words, the impassioned, heart-fond communing, are untrue and superficial and artificial. So they are words that are used in love exchanges in order to gain erotic benefits. So since the poem is itself a message addressed to the reader, Landon warns her readers that love letters and love poems should not be interpreted as sincere, thus exposing the code of romantic love that poets such as Byron manipulated to gain female hearts. I took the scroll. I could not brook an eye to gaze on it save mine. I could not bear another's look should dwell upon one thought of thine. My lamp was burning by my side. I held thy letter to the flame. I marked the blaze swift over it glide. It did not even spare thy name. Soon the light from the embers passed. I felt so sad to see it die, so bright at first, so dark at last. I feared it was love's history. Landon's use of quatrains with jumping pentameters and trimeters give her poem intensity. the disconcerting juxtaposition of sentimentality and detached cynicism teases and repels at the same time, bringing to the fore the status of lyric poetry as a mere consumable commodity. In fact, many of the annals where these poems were published were used themselves as gifts addressed to win women's heart. In some journals, like the New Monthly Magazine from 1825, a section known as the Literary Souvenir was advertised as a present that no gentleman need to be ashamed to place in the hands of a lady on New Year's Day. Jennifer Wallace notes that readers' preferences were commanding the literary market at the time. So finally, we get to our last author. Felicia Hemans reveals her interest in art in a letter from 1811, where she writes, "I've been reading lately the memoirs of Sir Joshua Reynolds, with his discourses to the Royal Academy, and I am so enthusiastic and admire of the beauties of paintings that I derive both pleasure and instructions from the perusal." Indeed, according to Reynolds, and I quote, "No art can be engrafted with success on another art, for though they all profess the same origin, each has its own peculiar modes, both of imitating nature and of deviating from it, each for the accomplishment of its own particular purpose. These deviations, more specifically, will not bear transplantation to another soil." So, as we can see, Reynolds seems to be in agreement with the initial ideas of Coleridge and some of Wordsworth, where the transportation of art from one type of art to another type of art was not so successful, no? It is well known that William Blake, who initially trained under Reynolds' supervision, was in disagreement also with this idea that the different arts need to perform their work independently. As you remember, William Blake wrote most of his poems with illustrations, and he illustrated them himself. And a lot of Felicia Hemans' work on ekphrasis is also a refutation of Reynolds. Possibly the most famous ekphrastic poem by Hemans is The Dying Gladiator, which appears in one of her first publications, The Domestic Affections and Other Poems, from 1812. It was written in 1810, and the poem was presented to the new Dygate Prize competition established by the University of Oxford in 1806 to acknowledge the best ekphrastic poem in recognition of the ancient Greek and Roman remains of architecture, sculpture, and painting. In 1810, the subject was the dying gladiator. The following year's topic ranged from the Parthenon to Apollo, Belvedere, Trajan's Pillar, and so on. So as mentioned before, the University of Oxford initiated this competition, stimulated by the excavations at the Herculaneum and Pompeii, and the writings of German archaeologist Johann Winkelmann, who was invited on several occasions to the Royal Society. One of his lectures also mentioned the dying gladiator when it was discovered in Rome. So the dying gaul, or the dying gladiator, was drawn by John Brown in 1772 after the sculpture in Rome, and it's annotated in pink in pen and ink on the bottom left, Mr. Townley. Remember, we mentioned that Townley was a very wealthy antiquarian collector who had been traveling the tour of Italy buying antiques, which included not just this drawing by John Brown of the dying gladiator, but also the vase which had inspired Keats' poem Ode on a Grecian Urn. So both pieces are part of the Townley collection at the British Museum. As mentioned, Hemans wrote a number of ekphrastic poems, and we can maybe mention The Queen of Prussia's Tomb from 1826 and The Last Song of Sappho from 1831. Sappho was a very popular topic. Not only Hemans wrote about her, but also London. Some critics have claimed that her Hemans' most important ekphrasis is Propersia Rossi, which is included in her feminist collection Records of Women from 1828. In Propersia Rossi, Hemans adopts the form of a dramatic monologue to tell the life of the historical Italian Renaissance sculpture under the same name, Propersia Rossi. The poem was inspired by a painting representing Rossi showing her last work, a bas relief of Ariadne to a Roman knight, the object of her affection, who regards the painting with indifference. In her poem, Emmons suggests that Rossi's life ended tragically because of the knight's failure to respond sympathetically to her love. And the same occurs in The Last Song of Sappho. This is the same topic. And also in Corinne at the Capitol, which is the one that we're going to briefly explore. So Corinne at the Capitol is inspired in the life of the Greek poetess, the most popular one after Sappho. Only fragments of her works survive, and scholars are divided in their dating. For some, the writing comes from the 5th century before Common Era, situating Corinne as a contemporary of Pindar, another very famous poet. To others, her style is closer to that of the 3rd century before Common Era, and there seems to be a mention of a sculpture of Corinna by Greek sculptor Silanion from this period. However, evidence is inconclusive. 42 fragments of Corinna's poetry survive, some preserved in pieces of papyrus discovered in various locations in Egypt during archaeological excavations. Corinna's poetry often reworks mythological tradition and local legends, as her most substantial fragments, the Daughters of Asophus and Terpsichore poems, demonstrate. So Corinna, like Pindar, wrote choral lyric poetry, and she used to invoke Terpsichore, who was the muse of dance and chorus, in her fragments. So as we have mentioned, Emmons Corinne is inspired by Corinne ou l'Italie, which is a novel published by Anne de Stel Holstein, known as Madame de Stel, in 1807. And she was a Franco-Swiss woman of letters. And the novel is a fictional travelogue that discusses the problems of female artistic creativity in two different cultures, England and Italy. Madame de Stel was very well connected, and she had met Goethe as well as other famous artists like Friedrich Schlegel's wife, who was translating Corinne into German. Madame de Stel had also published in 1800s a research exploring the social impact of literary practices on society, entitled De la littérature considérée dans ses rapports avec les institutions sociales. That is a treatise of ancient and modern literature and the influence of literature upon society. So, like other romantics, de Stel believed that literary works must express the moral and historical reality, the zeitgeist of the nation in which the work was conceived, an idea later expanded also by Hippolyte Taine. So Madame de Stel's novel inspired not only Hemans' poem, but also several paintings and engravings, among them Corinne au Cap Misen by François Gérard, where Madame de Stel appears portrayed posthumously as her character Corinne. This painting is from 1819. The following year, 1820, William Blake drew the head of Corinna the Theban, and for his collection, The Visionary Heads, a series of black chalk and pencil drawings produced by William Blake after 1818. Blake claimed to have seen visions from his young age throughout his life, and in these visions he was visited by spirits of people from the remote past, as well as by his deceased friends, and from whom he received inspiration. So the two sketches, he drew two sketches on Corinne, and one of them is shown on your screen. With he portrayed Corinne with a half-open mouth as she was reading her poetry. So in Corinne or Italy, Madame de Staël's novel, Corinne sings 3 times. She performs the 3 times in front of an audience. The first song is performed at the Capitol in front of a large crowd, and it's a great success, a celebration of her figure. Her second song is sung at the Cape of Misenna before local people and some of her friends. And on this occasion, she has the premonition that her love, Oswald, may forsake her in the near future, that he will abandon her. In Corinne's last song, which is performed before an audience invited to the Florence Academy, she's heartbroken and fatally ill. So the story proceeds in the tone of the songs and changes from glorious to sorrowful. Hemans focuses on the heroine's first and triumphant song at the Capitol. So Leticia Elizabeth Landon, in a similar poem entitled Corinne at the Cape of Misenna from 1832, which was published in an annual entitled The Amulet, also alludes to Corinne, but to her second son. Corinne's story, in all her versions, whether pictorial or literary, deal with the difficulties of reconciling women's professions and their domestic roles. In Madame de Staël's novel, Corinne is a strong and intelligent woman, and for this reason, the male protagonist feels threatened and cannot make a decision to marry her. As in Hemans' poem, the radiant daughters of the sun, this is one of the lines in the poem, dies of a broken heart when her lover settles for another. Happier far than her. This is another line. And she makes the humblest hearth lovely, but to no one on earth. This is one of the conclusions of the poem. The humblest hearth refers to her lack of domestic abilities, for which she ends up not loved by anyone on earth. So, as mentioned, Corinne at the Capitol is prefaced by an epigraph from Germaine de Staël on the influence and passions on the happiness of individuals and nations, which expresses the idea that lives of married women and mothers hold as much value as the lives of any writer. However, these lines need to be read in an ironic context, just as Hemans' poem, which provides a commentary on Madame de Staël's novel. So Hemans' Corinne at the Capitol can be viewed as a radical departure from contemporary understandings of gender and gender roles. Throughout Hemans' poem, women are encouraged to widen their horizons and seek satisfaction from their work. By comparing a happy housewife to a trailblazer, Hemans points out that a woman's job must extend beyond the borders of the home earth without diminishing the importance of those who choose to be housewives and mothers. So we have come to the end of our lecture. If you want more information on Landon or Hemans, please refer to your Campus Virtual Campus, where you can find summaries of all the works. And to conclude, this lecture has explored the evolution of the concept of ekphrasis and connected to intermediality and the fluidity of media borders between the arts. In particular, we have concentrated on the Romantic period in order to see the relationship between these ideas and the impact of aesthetics and philosophical thought during this period. The lecture has also included a comparative introduction highlighting the main aspects that influenced British Romanticism, comparing also with German Romanticism. And the lecture purpose has been to emphasize that artistic representation is a performative tool, an act of communication that has an impact on the political and on the public sphere. Many of the poems presented establish a dialogue with other artistic forms, architecture, painting, sculpture. The combinations of different artistic representations around the same objects contributes to give them visibility, to give them public visibility, as well as memorialization. So rather than presenting aspects of intermediality which only occurs in media combinations, for example in cinema, graphic novels, or in digital formats, the examples examined, which belong to the Romantic period, could only be considered forms of remediation or transformation of media formats. In the following video, in the following lecture, we will explore how 20th century has contributed to explore media combinations in more radical ways, enabling, for example, the introduction of simultaneity in multiple representations that were previously merely sequential. The futurists, for example, were open to multisensory experiments as well, bringing to the fore the impact of graphic coding, typography, typefaces, textures, and other material aspects of language. The increasing use of montage, involving several perceptual modes, along with the development of digital media, with its articulation of multiple media spaces, some of them interactive, has opened electronic artworks to their audiences. So ekphrastic models based on the replication of patterns and structural analogies are facing new challenges in the 20th and 21st centuries. Thank you very much for your attention.